Thank you, Dr. Zarni, and also special thanks to Professor Barbara for this kind invitation. I've come here to actually listen from the experts, learn from the experts, but I've also been asked by Dr. Zarni to share some perspectives on Malaysia's position and also ASEAN's position on the Rohingya. And perhaps my colleague from Indonesia will also continue on their experience in dealing with Rohingya refugees. As far as my organization is concerned, in ASEAN region, we work with a human rights organization in addressing the plight of Rohingya refugees, as well as addressing their immigration issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I had argued previously in another forum that mere democracy without human rights means nothing for a nation's inhabitants, in particular racial and religious minorities, as this would result in tyranny of the majority. This is surely not the kind of society that anyone in this world, particularly those who claim to champion liberal values such as Myanmar's democratic icon and Nobel Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, would seem to want if their claims are to be believed as genuine. The only kind of democracy that is acceptable for everyone who lives in the here and now in this 21st century is the variant that accommodates differences, and that means due accord and respect for fundamental liberties, especially for ethnic minorities, with limitations only insofar as they are necessitated to keep the peace and secure national interests from internal as well as external threats. Sadly, Myanmar, despite its recent transition, has utterly failed in this regard. I will continue with the Malaysia's position and also the ASEAN position and conclude with our own view on the way forward. I make the same argument again as I have made before, namely that democracy without protection of the human rights of minorities in itself cannot ensure a prosperous and free society, for democracy always translates as rule of the majority. So while Myanmar has made a seemingly legitimate transition from authoritarian rule to one with democratic mandate, the refusal of Aung San Suu Kyi in particular and its other leaders in general to condemn and mitigate the sufferings of their Rohingya community is inexcusable. Myanmar must make amends and move immediately to secure the rights of the Rohingya, restoring their citizenship and guarantee their right to keep their Islamic faith and to live within Myanmar as a dignified person, free from one of persecution by its Burmese majority. Until then, its transition to democracy cannot be deemed genuine and must thus be dismissed for the farce it really is. Ladies and gentlemen, reports of what happened to the Rohingya community in Myanmar scarcely scratch the surface when it comes to the grim everyday realities they face. Effectively rendered stateless by the stripping of their citizenship by the state, they frequently are found migrating abroad in search for relief from all the pain and sufferings they face. And even then, for those who are lucky enough to escape the clutches of the Burmese regime, for those who are not quite as fortunate, they are forced to live in ghettos and refugee camps as internally displaced persons. In 2012, riots took place in Rakhine State, where most of them live by Rakhine Buddhists, due to a false rumors that Muslims raped and murdered an ethnic Rakhine woman. As a result, thousands of Rohingya were forced to flee their homes and businesses, and much damage occurred to their persons as well as their property. They were even labeled terrorists, and while all this was occurring, it did not once occur to the so-called beacon of democratic reform, Aung San Suu Kyi, to speak against violence committed against them. In 2015, many Rohingya fled Myanmar to go to nations all over Southeast Asia as refugees. Among the countries of choice were ASEAN members, as Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia. We gladly received some of them on our shores and gave them the refuge they deserved, but they should not have had to flee Burma in the first place. If only the Burmese government will stop its pretense and acknowledge their pride. But far from this, there is evidence that the government of Myanmar is engaging in ghettoization. Researchers from the International State Crime Initiative, as we have heard the whole today, Professor Green and also Professor Daniel have elaborated on the question of genocide. But will the international community act, ladies and gentlemen? On the Malaysia position, Malaysia has always been a responsible member of the United Nations. This is the official position. I'm just sharing not my views. And has always played a role of a peaceful mediator when it comes to world conflict. We oppose, and Malaysia has opposed and denounced the apartheid regime in South Africa right up to its collapse in 1984. And our soldiers have been active in UN peacekeeping missions in the former Yugoslavia as well as in various nations throughout Africa. Our mediators have also had extensive experience brokering talks between national liberation movements and national governments in the southern Philippines, resulting in significant concessions for minorities living under the rule of such governments. The former UN Secretary General Special Envoy to Myanmar, Razali Ismail, is himself from Malaysia. Thus, Malaysia is well placed to put forth views and recommendations on this matter, and so it has done for the consideration of the international community. According to Amitav Acharya in his book Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia, ASEAN and the Problem of Regional Order, Malaysia's position on the plight of the Myanmar people has always been one of solidarity with their cause and grievances against the Burmese state. Malaysia had initially resisted Myanmar's entry into ASEAN in the 1990s due to their persecution of the Rohingya, and only relented when Singapore, also a member of ASEAN then, insisted that the internal affairs of ASEAN were not relevant to its application for membership of ASEAN. Thereafter, Malaysia consistently pushed for the greater protection of the Rohingya, as can be gleaned from its various statements on the issue from the 1990s until this very day. For example, Malaysia, together with Indonesia, took in as many as 7,000 Rohingya boat people during the 2015 refugee crisis, and together with ASEAN and Western governments demanded that Myanmar account for its discriminatory actions. Syed Hamid Alba, a former Malaysian defense as well as foreign minister, writing in the LA Times on 18 April 2016 on his appointment as the OIC Special Envoy to Myanmar, stated that it was time for the Burmese regime to stop mistreating Rohingya Muslims, and that the overlook by Aung San Suu Kyi and the Burmese government of the atrocities is simply unacceptable. He postulated that trade between Myanmar and Muslim nations of the world, particularly those in ASEAN, were blossoming, and this should not be jeopardized on account of what is going on with respect to Muslims in Myanmar, and additionally warned that political, economic, and national security benefits that would otherwise be available would not be if Myanmar continues its policy of systematic discrimination and even genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. On the ASEAN positions of ASEAN position on the Rohingya, ladies and gentlemen, its position on Myanmar and its treatment of Rohingya is more complex. And according to an article by Aung Zon titled ASEAN-Burma Relations, their position has been fragmented with multiple positions held by individual members of ASEAN. While Indonesia, like Malaysia, has been supportive of the plight of the Rohingya, the Singaporean government, for example, has always demonstrated no interest whatsoever in the nature of Myanmar's political system, whether it be democratic or otherwise, nor how it treats its own minorities, despite proclaiming itself a model multiracial republic. As written by Aung San, and I quote, Singapore had little interest in human rights issues and no real objections to the Burmese regime's treatment of its political opponents, but was concerned about its handling of the country's economy and particularly its policies towards foreign investment. Through their support of the Burmese regime's interest in ASEAN, Singapore hoped to gain influence over the economic thinking of Burmese military leaders and gain greater access to the country's natural resources and huge market for weapons. Singapore has long been a major supplier of arms to Burma. Indeed, this was demonstrated when Singapore assisted in the supply of arms to the military junta in the late 1980s following the 1988 uprising. Ladies and gentlemen, in November 1997, Singapore refused to back a UN resolution critical of widespread human rights abuses in Myanmar and calling on the then military junta to recognize the result of the 1990 general elections. Bila Hari Kausikan, the Singaporean representative told the UN General Assembly that his government could not support this resolution because, I quote, our position is different, we have concrete and immediate stakes. Indeed, Singapore has always prioritized economic interests above all else, and this is no different with Myanmar. And this was clearly indicated when Lieutenant General Kim Nyun, the then powerful first secretary of the ruling junta, instructed a coordinating board for the Myanmar-Singapore Joint Ministerial Working Committee to give priority to projects arranged by Singapore. However, since the 1990s, ASEAN has managed to agree to a joint position termed constructive engagement. According to this theory, originating with Thai former Foreign Minister Arsa Sirasin, one must change battlefields to marketplaces by engaging with dialogue and not isolating the Burmese regime. In other words, to engage and create ties with Burma rather than to ignore and isolate it. However, the goals of the policy have never been as obvious as the rationale. The policy has been utilized as a vehicle through which varied economic, security, and political interests of ASEAN members have been pursued. Politically, at the ASEAN level, its most salient feature has been non-interference, as mentioned by the previous professor, non-interference in Burmese domestic political affairs, leaving the then junta to take care of its own affairs. This fanciful theory resulted in Myanmar joining ASEAN in 1997 without making significant changes to its governmental system, nor in particular its treatment of Rohingya. The regime stepped up its campaign of repression against the democratic opposition and ethnic groups, evidently believing that admission to ASEAN was a sign of approval for its previous policy. Fortunately, when we fast forward to the present, the situation has changed somewhat, and there is now much more sympathy for the plight and suffering of the Rohingyas. And I hope that this trend will continue. As a delegation from the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights visited the region of Mandalay in Myanmar in 2015, April, and as a result has issued a document detailing the situation faced by them in Burma, titled The Rohingya Crisis and the Risk of Atrocities in Myanmar, and their findings make for grim reading. According to them, the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya at the hands of national and regional government authorities in Myanmar has resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, in particular since the 2012 ethnic riot. This has in turn led to the highest outflow of refugees by sea since the US war in Vietnam during the 1970s, and human rights violations against Rohingya have resulted in a regional human trafficking epidemic. Further, the government of Myanmar imposes severe restrictions on Rohingya, including restriction of movement, marriage, childbirth, and other aspects of everyday life, as we have heard today. And most troubling of all, say this group of parliamentarians, is the denial of Rohingya identity, which is a factor that clearly, effectively denies their existence. Most unfortunately, this continues to be absent from the agenda of ASEAN summits. And ladies and gentlemen, in our view, Malaysia's recent position and response to this issue has so far been feeble at best. Okay. It has condemned the daily massacres, but short of making periodic statements of condemnation and solidarity, does next to nothing to stop them. Malaysia, along with Indonesia and Singapore, are responsible for the admittance of Myanmar into ASEAN, in spite of the situation of the Rohingya and the fact that Malaysia has not ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention, nor accepted its fair share of Rohingya refugees, despite itself being a Muslim majority nation and one that is supposedly committed to human rights. ASEAN's collective official lackadaisical attitude towards Rohingya is no different. And as a result, the Rohingya continue to bear the brunt of the Burmese regime's discriminatory policies towards them, policies that have not been changed at all, even with the election of a new democratic government at the helm. Aung San Suu Kyi continues to turn a hypocritical blind eye and maintains a position of indifference to the daily massacres of Rohingya by what is now effectively her government, and for this, in our view, she deserves only the strongest condemnation. Thank you.